chasing man. He shows how.
Couple Outfitters specializes in adventure gear. Anything you need for getting outside, Couple Outfitters has it and more. Go have an adventure now.
We'll get those live bed sifting clips, strap down those rods, and hang on because we are going fishing. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Bass Tour Anglers Podcast. Thank you for being with us. Please hit the subscribe button at the bottom of this page and subscribe to this channel so you can always get the very latest content right when it drops. Also, we'd love to have you check out our website, BassTourAnglers.com. There, you can follow our Bass Tour Anglers Podcast Angler of the Year race, see all of our content, and contact us directly because we're not snobs. We want to hear from you. Our guest is a true legend of tournament bass fishing. He was inducted into the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame in 2018. He's fished over 500 tour-level events in his 40-plus years of tournament fishing. He's qualified for an astounding 30 Bassmaster Classics as well as 6 FLW Tour Championships. He has 2 BASS Angler of the Year titles. He's a former U.S. Open winner, and he's the co-founder of Major League Fishing, and the list goes on and on. Gary Klein, welcome to the Bass Tour Anglers Podcast. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. That was a kind introduction, believe me. Bottom line is I'm just somebody that has a passion for fishing.
Well, listen, Gary, but before we get too far into this, it was 1981. You, Greg Hines, and Rich Tauber, remember those names?
Oh, yes.
You guys were doing a Western Bass seminar in Costa Mesa, and that's where I was hooked. I was absolutely captivated by tournament bass fishing, and here I am, however many years later, still hopelessly hooked.
Well, don't age us, okay?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's, look back on my career and, obviously I'm looking forward too, because there's a lot of really good stuff that's going on. But as a young kid growing up in Northern California at the age of 15, when I was introduced to my first competition, I mean, there's not another occupation that I believe that I could have ever gotten involved in that's taught me more about life, more about the person that I am than competitive angling. Having the opportunity, to travel the country and abroad has really been very rewarding for me. And I look forward to the future.
It's so well put. This is one of the interviews I've really had on my list of things to do for a while because you are such a big part of the history of this sport. And I wanted to start back. I want to go back to your roots. I know you grew up in California. I grew up in California. I'm still growing up in California. But you trained under the guidance of Dee Thomas, Dave Glebe, some really, really just amazing names out here in the West Coast. What were those years like? I mean, what was it like to tool dip with Dee Thomas?
Well, I was kind of like the son that Dee never had. Dee has 3 daughters. I believe when I met Dee, he was 32 and I was 15. Mm-hmm. In fact, the first competition I ever experienced was on Lake Oroville. And the winner of that event was Dee Thomas. And that was when I introduced myself to Dee. And I'll never forget it as long as I live. I introduced myself to Dee and said, "Hey, Dee, my name's Gary Klein. And one of these days, I'm going to be as good as you." And Dee reached out, gave me a big bear hug and looked me in the eyes and said, "Bring it on."
I love it.
Dee's just a competitor. And Dee taught me a lot about, obviously, about shallow water fishing. But he also taught me a lot about strategies and how to cat and mouse and how to kind of, move around through the field and be very, very competitive. So Dee was that angler that taught me a lot about an aspect of competitive angling. But, over the years, not only was I close to Dee Thomas, but one of my first bass clubs I was ever involved in was the Green Machines, the San Diego club. And, that was Mike Folkestad.
Right.
And the whole group of guys down there, we competed a bunch. But, Mike was the angler. I called him Mikey when I was growing up. But Mike taught me how to fish offshore. Mike taught me how to read electronics. Dee taught me how to read the bank and understand a competitive field of anglers. So, Mike was offshore, Dee was on the bank, and there's another gentleman that I met when I was 15 that happened to live in Orville, and that's Rich Foreham. And Rich Foreham was somebody that really intrigued me because working at the marina every day, I was a bass fisherman, and there was very few of us back then. But Richard was on the lake all the time in his little aluminum boat, 20 horse Mercury on it, and he was a spinning rod fisherman, and he always caught the fire out of smallmouth. Orville used to have a really good population of smallmouth. So I really got to spend a lot of time with Richard, became very close with Richard and his family. And Richard and I spent a lot of time on the water, but Richard taught me how to fish a spinning rod and 6-pound test line. Dee taught me how to fish the bank with a long rod. And Mike Folkestad taught me how to read offshore cover, with my flash or with my electronics. So I was kind of at the very young age of being introduced to all aspects of angling. And I was just intrigued with it. Having the opportunity to fish with Mike on Lake Powell, Lake Mojave, Mead, Havasu, Clear Lake. Mike come up and spend a lot of time with me fishing Clear Lake. And of course, he set the records at Clear Lake. So yeah, I was very fortunate to have the knowledge presented to me. But again, though, we're talking about in the early 70s. It was 73 when Dee won that first event. I was a sophomore in high school. I didn't graduate high school until 75. And in 79 is when I left California to come out and fish full-time on the BASS circuit. But the one factor that gave me the confidence to finally get out of California was the fact that I could flip. And nobody knew what flipping was. They'd heard a little bit, but nobody really went after it wide open. So when I left California in 79, I had 7 rods in my rod locker, and they're all flip sticks. And, that's all I did was flip and practice and flip during the tournament. And, I had a very fun first year. It was very intriguing. And had I have had better equipment, I would have won Angler of the Year hands down. But Roland beat me at the last day of competition. And I think he beat me by 1 pound and 4 ounces. So, no, it's fun. And still I enjoy to fish. I fish all the time.
I really wanted to also kind of talk about that development of the flip and stick because that to me is one of the first specialized rods that I can ever remember. Now, is it true you started out with a 12-foot long rod?
That's correct. Yeah. The first rod that Dee ever put in my hand was a single piece. It was a saltwater blank with no fishing reel on it. And we just had braid, Dacron basically spliced with monofilament. And I spent a lot of time with Dee on the Sutter Bypass, Butte Creek, and obviously the Delta. And we had no trolling motor. Dee used a paddle in his aluminum boat. And we had a lot of memorable times.
Now, as they do, a lot of anglers complained about this 12-foot rods. And so there had to be, they had to figure out a length that everybody could live with, I guess. Is that right?
Well, that's actually how the actual flipping technique was developed. What happened is that Dee was an angler that fished the Delta all the time with a long rod. Tule dipping is what they call it. And Dee was very good at it. So Dee was actually invited to start fishing some of the team tournaments that we had that were just upstarted. And when he did, he started winning them. And he won just about every one he fished. But the reason why Dee was able to win those events is as bass fishing evolved, in the 70s, everybody sat down, everybody casted overhand. And by just that lure presentation by itself basically left all them shallow water fishing heavy cover wide open. They were unmolested. And Dee was using a long rod to catch the fish. And what happened over about a year and a half period when Dee was winning all these events, well, the other anglers, instead of giving Dee the credit for being the angler that he was, they obviously thought that he was winning because they were at a disadvantage. So basically what happened is that they had a newly formed tournament committee that showed up at his hotel door the night before a tournament and basically told Dee that they outlawed a 12-foot rod. We're not going to let you fish with a 12-foot rod. So Dee, being the competitor that he is, said, okay, you guys pick length. What length do you think you would live with? And they came up with 7.5 feet. So Dee went out to his truck, took a hacksaw and cut his 12-foot blank down to 7.5 foot. And guess what happened the next day? He won the event. But what it did though, is it forced Dee to develop the flipping technique, because with the long rod that was 12 foot in length, Dee had a reach. So when he cut his blank down to 7.5 foot, he lost that reach. So Dee basically duct tape or used black tape and put a bait casting reel and put some guides on that blank. And that's how he came up with the actual flipping technique. He had to develop something to give him more distance. And that's how the flipping technique evolved. And of course, in the early years, he got involved with a gentleman by the name of Dave Myers. At the time, Dave was the president of Fenwick, right, and they designed the Dee Thomas flipping stick. A great marketing tool. And it was a great rod.
I had one of those. I think I still have it somewhere.
I still have 3 of them out in my shop. The original, the 775s.
Now that's such a great story, Gary. I mean, this is a story that everybody needs to hear because there's so much history in this technique. I'm watching the Bassmaster Classic today, and these guys are heavy flooded brush at Ray Roberts, and man, everybody is up there doing that right now. And it's so refreshing to see that, because it seems like so much has moved off the banks, but it's fun to watch an event like that where guys are doing all that stuff.
Oh, exactly. It's one of the most fascinating techniques I've ever used, because every lure presentation, you actually expect a strike.
Right.
And it's basically, close range quarters, fighting them big fish out of heavy cover. But through my experiences with flipping has evolved also. The lures that we use are different now, or not different, but there's a lot more lures that we use to flip. We're just not always flipping heavy line. A lot of times I love to flip a drop shot on 10-pound test line. I still use my same 8-foot flip stick. It's a parabolic bend, special design flip stick. But I use it when I'm fishing heavy braid, big jigs, or even light line in a drop shot with small hooks.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about what the rod you're currently using. You're currently working with Ducket Fishing, and I noticed on the Ducket website that they've got a Pro Series Gary Klein model. It's an 8-foot extra heavy, fast tip, handles 1/2 to 2 ounce baits. Is that your flipping stick?
That is correct. That is my design flip stick. I don't like it when they say extra heavy, because it's not an extra heavy rod. If anybody ever picks that rod up, it's very light. I think it weighs like 5 ounces or less. It's a 1-piece 8-foot blank, but it's truly parabolic bend. So it's got a really, really what I call a slow tip on it. It's got a lot of backbone. It's a great rod for fishing braid. And it's a great rod for flipping, 10-pound test line also.
Hey folks, you know that we've been working with Tacticam fisheye cameras for quite a while now. Check this out.
Hold your head high as you forfeit my love. Always the vulture, though you look like a dove. Worst kind of love makes pain necessary.
170 degree standard wide angle lens. Plug-in option for all-day power. Remote sync with your smartphone. Waterproof to 30 feet. Patented interchangeable lens system, all at about half the cost of what the other guys charge. Tacticam fisheye cameras, because that fish of a lifetime happens once in a lifetime. We're talking to Gary Klein, one of the true pioneers of our sport. Gary, so you took flipping back east to compete in the BASS tour in those days. The events were pro versus pro back then, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure people picked up on that pretty quickly.
Yeah, we always drew boat to boat. In fact, my first event in 1979 was on the St. Johns River. And in the course of those 3 days, I actually drew Tom Mann Sr. And I had the opportunity to fish with Tom. And I had the opportunity to teach him how to flip. And Tom was kind enough to let me run the trolling motor. He still sat in his seat on the bow of the boat, but he let me flip. And I ended up 10th in my first BASS event, and it was all flipping. But it was a new technique. Everybody was intrigued with it. And now it's just a staple. Everybody's got a flip stick in the boat. Anybody that bass fish has a flip stick. But a lot of the young anglers today that are being exposed to the flipping technique have no idea the history behind it and how it got to the point where it is today. In fact, Dee Thomas, a great friend of mine, I talk to Dee about every other week. He lives up there, on the Delta, still fishes about 3 or 4 days a week. He's like me. I mean, we have a passion for fishing.
It's such a good story. I know that professional anglers all have their pride but I mean, when you take a look at that technique, it's kind of like in professional sports, in the coaches, you have disciples of these coaches that branch off and do their own thing. I'm looking at the pros that have made their name on this flipping technique. Guys like Denny Brower, guys like Tommy Biffle, and Greg Hackney. I mean, then the list goes on. I'm sure I'm missing some important people.
Hank Parker.
Oh, Hank Parker. Oh my gosh, yes. What an amazing legacy for you to have.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm very humbled. And, back in the 70s, when I left California to come out and fish, I've never had another occupation but competitive angling. Graduated high school in 75, stayed around on the West Coast. Back then, I was fishing Western bass, NorCal bass, everything that we had on the West Coast. In 79, I was young, broke, living with my parents. I was working at the marina making $1.65 an hour. And I decided through a little bit of guidance with Rich Forehand, and what really made me make the decision is Richard sat me down at his breakfast table at his house, and he said, "Look, Gary," he said, "you need to be out on the BASS circuit." He said, "You're broke. What's the worst thing that can happen to you?" He said, "You'll go broke." And he said, "You're already broke. You're not committed. You have no obligations." He said, "Leave, because you can flip better than anybody." So I needed to go out here. And it was because of that conversation that allowed me to have the confidence in myself. I left California with $1,000 in my pocket, no credit cards. In my first BASS tournament, back then the entry fees were $250. First place was $10,000. And, we fished 6 events. So when I left in 79, not only was I fishing BASS, I was still fishing Western bass and NorCal bass and everything else that I could get my hands on. But my second BASS event was on Lake Powell. And I figured that I'd already prepaid 2 entry fees. By the time I got to Lake Powell, if I was broke and it wasn't going to work out for me, I was only about 11 hours up and over the mountains to go back to Northern California. But I kind of goofed that up, and I was fortunate enough I won Lake Powell. So I won my second BASS tournament that I ever fished.
That's good stories. So speaking of stories, you mentioned Tom Mann Sr. Anybody else in those first couple of events that you fished with that just became an absolute believer in the technique?
Well, I think just about everybody that I fished with did.
Yeah.
Shorty Evans, who has since passed away. Shorty Evans fished BASS from the early years. Shorty was my final day partner at Lake Powell. So he actually got to watch that technique, really, really shine up there. But so many anglers that I've drawn over my career when we used to always draw boat to boat, where they actually got to see it firsthand, were truly amazed. But these anglers are good.
Yeah.
And literally, an afternoon in the boat with me or a day in the boat with me, and they're onto it.
Right.
I mean, guys like Rick Klein, I was real close to Ricky, and, Ricky he picked up on it real quick. But if you go back and you look at all of the anglers that have the names, the Roland Martins, the Jimmy Houstons, the Rick Kleins, the Hank Parkers, they all have notched victories using the flipping technique. So it's the technique I knew that was going to be around for years. It's going to continue to be around for years because all the flipping technique is a method that gives an angler an opportunity to present an artificial bait to bass in shallow water cover. That's all it is. No different to throwing a spinner bait or a buzz bait or a crankbait or any of the other tools that we use as anglers to catch these fish. What I liked about the flipping technique is it was very close and personal. Your accuracy is like 100%, and I can really develop patterns within patterns. See, I'm the type of angler, competing across the country, going to different bodies of water. At the beginning of the week, I kind of look at myself as a generalist because I'm really good at doing a lot of things. But hour by hour, day by day, I like to kind of become more of a specialist. And I don't like to look and see everything down the shoreline or everything in the bay. I like to be able to look at the high percentage of places. And you can only do that by fishing and developing it on current conditions. The wind, the sun, the cloud cover, dirty water, clear water, we all know that, So that's the challenge that I've always enjoyed about being a competitive angler. At the end of the week, if you're beaten, I'm a loner. I like to fish by myself. I like to do things by myself, but it's trial and error, So if I'm successful, I did it on my own. If I got beat, then go back and study and figure out why. Maybe I need to, get better at a certain technique or get better at understanding a certain fish. But the cool thing about me and my career is that not only did I evolve or have I evolved as a person, as an angler. I mean, think about this. A 15-year-old kid in Northern California making $1.65 an hour, borrowed $1,000 from Bank of America on a personal loan. $93 a month is what my payments were. I deferred them for 3 months. I finished 10th in my first event, won my second event, led Angler of the Year all year long. Roland beat me on the final day of competition on Lake Millwood in Arkansas, a lake I'd never been to before. With success came responsibility, because now, not only as an angler am I learning, rods, reels, lines, lures, knots, boats, electronics, all the equipment, but I'm also learning a lot about the fish, time of year, type of fish, current conditions. But at the same time, I'm learning about me as an individual, because now, with success came, a financial responsibility. And I knew at a very early age that in order for me to compete and do what my vision was, nobody was going to pay me to get good. So I was going to have to basically support myself. So I was very fortunate at a very young age. I've always lived below my means. I've rat-holed everything I've ever won. And so I'm able to continue my career at my own pace. I know what I want to fish. I fish the best events that I can get get into, qualify for the biggest. But to me, it's just another day of fishing. I just try to put myself at that level in those events. But so basically what I'm trying to say is that I evolved with the fishing industry as it evolved. And where we are today for the young anglers or somebody that's just maybe wanting to get involved in the sport is a great, great time to get involved in the sport. Fishing today across this country is better than it's ever been. I can go out and I still have, so many 100 fish days, big bags now. We have a lot of quality fish in our water bodies that we have to fish. For example, I grew up on Clear Lake. I always prided myself that nobody knew the bottom of Clear Lake better than I did, because I spent so much time on it. But when I was fishing Clear Lake, a big stringer was, 15, 16 pounds, because they're all northerns. When I used to fish the Delta all the time in the 70s, NorCal bass, Western bass, West Coast bass, a big bag of fish on the California Delta was 16 pounds. And big fish would always be a 6'2", 6'3". Well, in 79, when I left California, the biggest thing that happened in California is they introduced Floridas. And all the aquatic vegetation that was introduced into the California Delta, because there was no aquatic vegetation when Dee and I used to fish it. We fished basically riprap, tule berms, dead wood, and pumps.
Yeah.
You had no big grass flaps. Same thing with Clear Lake. There was no Florida bass in Clear Lake. and there was no aquatic vegetation. It was all rocks and docks. So everything has evolved, but it's actually better now. I mean, gosh, you can go out and catch 30-pound bags for 5 fish. I mean, look at Clear Lake, you catch 40-pound stringer.
Yep.
So the anglers that are getting introduced to fishing today have better equipment. I mean, back in the early years when I started, there was no guarantee I was going to get to fish all day long, because I'd either break a cable on a trolling motor, my batteries would go dead, or a trim pump would go out, or something would happen with your equipment. Now, I mean, we fish for days and days and days and days and years and never have, any problems at all with our equipment. Our rods, reels, lines, lures, our hooks are all better than they've ever been. So now an angler can actually go out and enjoy his time on the water and travel like we all do and fish across the country. But fishing today is better than it's ever been.
Now, so about the time that that flipping was blowing up back east, and everybody was starting to do it and hit the banks heavy like that, you suddenly back off the bank and start catching fish in deep water, your shallow water routes, and you win a couple of BASS events on finesse techniques. That had to really blow everybody's minds, because here's a shallow water guy, and where is he catching him? What he's using, it's like the opposite, a 6-pound test line from what you're doing with flipping. That all came from your work with Mike Folkstead.
Well, it came from a combination of 3 individuals. My light line fishing came from Rich Forehand, who basically taught me how to fish 6-pound test line on a spinning rod. Folkstead helped me understand offshore structure and how fish relate by using electronics. And of course, I was very close to Don Ivino for quite a few years.
Oh, yeah.
And Don developed his own method of fishing 6-pound test line with, little hand-poured worms. We called it the doodling technique. And I had the opportunity, because I had that experience of fishing a spinning rod. When I observed the current conditions on some of the BASS events, it was amazing. For example, just a real quick story. I was actually rooming with Rick Klein, and I want to say it was 1988 on Bull Shoals. It was late October. Bull Shoals reminds me of a lake just like Lake Shasta. It was about 35 foot vertical down. The water was pristine and clean. But normally on a man-made reservoir in the fall, I always look for shad migrations up creek channels. So at noon, I was crankbaits in the back of some creek channels. I never had a bite. I drove back to the launch ramp, got my 3 spinning rods, my little box of doodle worms, and from noon until dark, I started fishing 35 to 60 foot. When I came in that night, Klein asked me, he said, "Well, how'd your day go?" And I said, "Well, it was pretty interesting once I got on to what was going on." He goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "I probably had 60 bites." And he said, "BS." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I only had 1 bite." And Ricky and I didn't talk a lot of fishing when we were together. So that next afternoon, now I had a pattern. And I ran it all day the second day of practice. And Ricky said, "Okay, Smarty, how many bites did you get today?" And I said, "Ricky, I probably had over 100. And he goes, "There's no way." And I go, "Ricky, they're deep. They're 30 to 60. And it became very obvious to me that I told Ricky, I said, "I'll win this event if I don't beat myself." And I was the only angler in the BASS field in 1988 on Bull Shoals to weigh a limit all 3 days.
Wow.
And I won that event. And then everybody out there, all the anglers I competed against kind of labeled it as sissy fishing.
Right.
Fish with a sissy rod.
Yeah.
But yet, it was a way to catch fish when they're offshore and deep. And of course, it's like I said, our anglers that compete at this level are very passionate anglers. They're very good at adapting. And it wasn't long after that everybody started, not only do they own a flip stick, but now they also have spinning rods in their boats.
Yep.
And I think just about maybe every angler that competes at our level, except for Klein, owns spinning rods. Ricky's still that hard-headed. He very rarely ever fishes a spinning rod.
Well, Gary, and the tours now all make a northern swing, which puts those smallmouth really in play. And you got to be able to fish that finesse stuff up there for those. Well,
yeah, you can power fish smallmouth. And there's a lot of techniques that I use. I mean, I'm grinding, what I call speed reeling with, big line, big baits. It's just moving real fast. So I'm just playing off the personality of the smallmouth, trying to get them to react. But there's two things that really have taken place over the last few years. Obviously the light line, but also the development of some of the Berkeley products, the Max Scent, the Gulp.
Yep.
Smallmouth are really, really nuts over that stuff. And our electronics. Our electronics, and of course, I've been Lowrance from the very beginning, but they've really, really stepped up their game. And now we have our active target, which is a forward imaging. So I can actually watch the fish react to my lures. So all this technology doesn't mean you're going to catch any more fish. But what it does, it's another tool that allows an angler that wants to put forth a little bit of study time the opportunity to basically look at fishing in a different way.
Koppel Outfitters wants you to go have an adventure now. Koppel Outfitters specializes in adventure gear. Anything you need for getting outside, Koppel Outfitters has it and more. Go have an adventure now.
We're talking to Gary Klein, 30 Bassmaster Classics, and co-founder of Major League Fishing. Gary, in the early 2000s, I know we've talked before. I was doing an internet radio show back in those days. Who knew they would call that a podcast at some point? But anyway, there was an angler advocacy movement that was taking place at that time. And I really liken it to Major League Baseball's free agency that took place. And you were involved in that. Can you talk a little bit about the Professional Angler Association and the impact it's had on today's fishing?
Well, in the early years, it was called the PAA. Again, our sport has been evolving and continues to evolve. And what we were trying to do is look at our anglers as athletes, which they are, and then try to create a level of professionalism amongst the anglers, dress codes and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera, and also to bring corporate dollars into our space for sponsorship. And, that was kind of the whole premise behind the PAA in the early years. And I mean the early years, because the PAA has been working with anglers on and off over, quite some time. But again, that's all part of the process, evolving, trying to find the right formula that works.
Major League Fishing. So many exciting things coming out of that camp. I had Boyd Duckett on the show not too long ago, and he and I talked about a parking lot discussion that the two of you guys had. And from that has sprung this amazing new organization. Give us a little bit of insight on what took place in that parking lot meeting.
Well, the parking lot meeting that you're referring to is at the Bassmasters Classic. I believe it was 2009 in Shreveport, Louisiana on the Red River. And, we're just two anglers and we're spooling line and man, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Or man, this sport needs to be like this, and, et cetera, et cetera. That conversation continues still today. But what we decided to do is let's give it a try. Let's try to elevate the sport, create a sport out of competitive angling. And, that's what we've been focused on. That's what we've been working with. Stuff like, our vision is grand. Let me just say that. Okay. It's way bigger than where we are today. If it was over with tomorrow, I wouldn't be satisfied. I'm not where our vision or my vision is for Major League Fishing and for the sport of competitive angling and for the conservation and for our fisheries across this country. There's always a better way, a better method. But yeah, that's how Major League Fishing started. The format came out of my head. If you take a look at the format of Major League Fishing, it's very easy to understand if you know that I'm the one that developed the format, because the format that I designed was based off of my 40 years of fishing conventional events. And there's nothing wrong. I mean, if it wasn't for the dream that Ray Scott had
Right.
and his vision, it wouldn't allow a 15-year-old kid from Northern California to have his dream or to live his dream. But over the years, it became very obvious to me that there's got to be more. There's got to be something better that's just never happened before. And again, this sport is evolving. And Boyd recognized that, because Boyd's train of thought was right along with mine. You know, how can we captivate a true sports audience? And how can we take our sport to network television and present it as a true sport? For example, you know, we air quite a few of our shows now on Discovery. And it's one of the highest rated programs on Discovery Channel. And that's a whole new audience than an outdoor channel, sportsman's product, but they cross over, because what we're doing is we're exposing our sport through our very competitive format, catch, weigh, release. Every scoreable bass counts, officials in the boat. And I mean, it just captivates you, because if you look at conventional events like I did, what other competition that's a true profession do you compete against another opponent and you have no idea where you stand?
Right. Absolutely.
You blast off in the morning, unless you happen to run into somebody during the course of the day and they're honest with you. You don't know what you're catching. I mean, you could have the best fishing day of your life, but you've been catching enough fish to get behind. Right. You're catching 3-pounders and you don't know if you need to be catching 4 or 5s. So with our score tracker, I mean, you know every fish that's being caught. You know when you need to move. There's a lot of strategy that's involved in it. The other thing that I never really appreciated or I didn't enjoy were blast-offs, because they were boat races. Oh. And there's a lot of anglers, you know, that don't have a lot of time in boats. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
And that's where all your equipment got beat up. And then you go out and you fish all day long and you develop an area, you got a pattern going and they're biting. So now what do? You have to look at your watch and figure, well, I got to leave in 45 minutes to make the race back to the weigh-in. Then when you get to the weigh-in, you stand there for 2.5 hours and go through the procedures when your day should be over with. You should be thinking about the next day of competition and preparing. So that's how the Major League Fishing format developed.
You know, Gary, traditionally, the bass tournament weigh-in has really been the public's first connection with that event. You know, they gather there to see what's going on. But today, with technology and the internet and score tracker, like you said, that day 2 of Group A, that last hour is intense. Group B, that last hour is brutal. The knockout round, unbelievable. And of course, championship day, you've got all these different intense dramas that build. I can't take my eye off it. And I would be willing to forfeit the weigh-in to be able to see that happen all week long.
Yeah, it is a little addictive, because there's a lot of pressure points during the course of the day. You know,
yes.
Not only do you have the guys, you know, running for the lead, but then there's so many lead changes, there's so many cut line changes, and there's a lot of strategy that you see the anglers use. So it's a fun format. I know from a competitor that creating the format, but having never lived it, was very important to me. So in, I want to say 2011, when we had our first competition on Lake Amstead, I made sure that I was in the first qualifying group. So I was one of the first of 8 anglers to ever play the game. And it was like, wow. I mean, I knew that at the end of that day, we had something to work with. And I talked to all the guys, they all had a big grin on their face. What our format does that a conventional format does not do is, in our format, you cannot get complacent.
Right.
Where if you go out and fish for 8 hours or 9 hours for 5 bites, you can get real complacent and you can go fish for 5 bites. But in our competitions, you have to catch them. Now, we're still fishing for the same size fish, but you just can't roll in on a spot and catch 25 pounds and coast the rest of the day, because these guys are good and they're going to catch you. So what it does, and our format is not for all anglers, because what it does is it pushes the anglers to limits that they've never experienced before. there's a lot of pressure involved in our competitions. And you see that with anglers that are competing. Some love the format. Some have a real hard time with it because, my God, I just caught one. You mean I got to catch another one?
Yeah.
It's amazing. You watch a guy, for example, I think it was Michael Neal caught like a 4.2, waded in, got back up, and this was just last week at Chick, stood back up, and he dropped 2 places. I mean, it was like, wow, that's that leaderboard update for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely love that score tracker. It is really, really cool. There's also a conservation aspect to what Major League Fishing is doing. The no touch rules and the 2-minute sit downs, very cool. And the release, I can't believe I watch it all, Gary. And some organizations, when they release a fish, it's back in there. You get sat down for doing that in an MLF event, right?
Yes, you do. And we've got some really cool rules. An angler's allowed to get out of his boat and go get a hooked fish. So if you do have a fish in a brush pile or up underneath a log, you don't have to break him off because you can't, get to him. You're allowed to get out of the water and go get the fish. There is a time penalty for that. But what I tried to do once I created the format and came back and created the rules, what I wanted to do is create a set of rules that gives our anglers that are competing a choice. They can make a choice on what they want to do, whether they have to step out on the dock, go get a lure undone, or go get a fish, get out of the boat for whatever reason, but they're just penalized by time. And in our score tracker, with our updates, sometimes you don't want to give anybody 5 minutes. So but at least you have that option to make a decision.
So this is a big year for the Bass Pro Tour. There's going to be some turnover, some new pros coming in. I've really enjoyed watching the Major League Fishing Pro Circuit guys, that have been in this new format. Can you tell our audience what this year's, why it's significant?
Well, I tell you, it's really cool. And again, it's like I've said at the beginning of the podcast that we are evolving. Angling is evolving. Competitive angling is evolving. And if you think about Major League Fishing, we started out fishing 2 cup events a year, and we were kind of like I don't want to say a reality show, but a lot of people said that's what we were. We had 24 anglers. Well, we knew that our vision was grand. And in order for us to get big, we got to continue to expand. So we went from 24 anglers to 48 anglers when we created the Slicks. And now we were actually producing 4 televised events a season. And that wasn't good enough for us. We want to continue to expand. So in November of 19, we acquired FLW.
Yeah.
And we went from an organization that was basically a media organization now to a full-blown largest tournament organization in the country. We have over 15,000 anglers that compete with us, and we put on 238 events per year across this country at all different levels. So it's been a real cool thing to integrate the 2 circuits. We did away with the name FLW. It's now MLF Big 5. Yeah. And the MLF, Major League Fishing Big 5, stands for 5 fish limit and 5 divisions: high school, college, BFLs, our Toyota Series, and our Pro Circuit event. But as we bring them together, our anglers on the Bass Pro Tour are not only competing, and every fish counts, at every event they go to, they're competing for the tour event that they're competing in, trying to qualify into a cup, trying to qualify for Red Crest, trying to qualify for heavy hitters, but also to try to make sure that you stay above the points cut so that you're not cycled out of the tour back into the pro circuit. So what we have now, at the end of this season, we'll have the top 10 on the pro circuit anglers in their points, their AOI points, will have an opportunity to come over and fish the tour events, where our bottom 10 anglers will cycle back out and have to requalify back into the tours.
Boy, there's drama everywhere in this organization.
Like I said, our vision is much grander than where we are right now.
Good stuff.
It really is. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that I can't discuss. It's all ongoing. And when it all comes out, you'll understand what I'm saying. It's all good. One of our primary focus is obviously catchway release or conservation. We just created a newly formed Major League Fishing Fish Management Division, our own conservation department, ran by Stephen Barden, one of the best fisheries biologists I've ever been around in my life. His vision is grand. And we're implementing a lot of our programs right now during the course of this season. One of the ongoing projects that we have right now is we are sampling, and you may have seen it on our live. We're taking DNA swab samples of all our 7-pound or bigger fish. And there's a reason for that. We're collecting that data for future research, but there's some studies that we're involved in right now, and that data collection is going to help us. That data collection is going to be expanded beyond just the Major League Fishing Tour event and the MLF Big 5 Pro Circuit event. We're actually going to create a retail DNA kit so that we can start collecting DNA from all fish across this country, from all anglers, whether it's a pond or stream, a lake, or whatever. That data collection will be published, and it'll be on our Major League Fishing Fisheries Management Division site, which is in construction, and it should be up now in the next couple of weeks. Been working on it for quite some time. So there's going to be a lot of interaction with just anglers across this country. And one of the things that we're really hoping to do with our research, with our education, with our fish management, and with our habitat restoration is a lot of the reservoirs that we have across this country, they're aging. And, we're not really building new reservoirs across this country. So a lot of your local fisheries have, they're working on things. A lot of your state agencies don't have the ability to cross state lines, but what we will do is connect everybody together with our data, because the data that we collect, I have the data on every scoreable bass that's ever been caught in the history of Major League Fishing. That data collection is huge for a state agency because they don't have the manpower or the resources to collect that type of data. So that's part of our ongoing. And the reason for this is we want to continue to make fishing better for everybody. And I don't care if it's bass or sunfish or crappie or catfish. I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't care what I caught. I just wanted to go fishing. And I want to see families be able to go out and go fishing and have really good experiences. And we're able to do that if we continue to do habitat restoration in a lot of our aging reservoirs and keep the population of fish up, because there's 3 different things that you need to have a good population of fish on any water body across this country. You got to have the right genetics. You have to have habitat, and you have to have the food source. And that's what we're going to, that's part of my mission. Maybe it's my way of giving back, but I know that I'm really involved in our fisheries management division, and I want to enhance fisheries for every angler across this country.
It's just really, really good stuff, Gary. I thank you so much for being with us today. I feel like we got probably 3 or 4 more podcasts about this length that we need to do, because there's a lot of stuff that we didn't get to cover today. But thanks so much, and best of luck to you. And we're going to be in touch again real soon. Okay.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it, because there's a lot of different directions that you and I could go on a podcast. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much, Keith.
All right. Thanks for being with us, Gary Klein. Appreciate your time today. And we will talk to you again very soon.